right, here we go. Yeah, so today I'll be talking about the different periods of Western classical music, and then, so just a couple of things. So, my background, I think, as you mentioned, is as a pianist, so some of my stuff sometimes is, biased or more geared towards, a piano perspective. But then, if you guys at any point have, any questions or any, comments or just, things to add based on what I'm saying, feel free to just jump in, but other than that, so... Yeah, so what we would consider Western classical music, right? Started approximately 1600, and then it goes till now. So all of our you can split Western classical music up into 4 main time periods, really. So that's your Baroque, your classical, your Romantic, and then some call it modern, contemporary, 20th century, 21st century, whatever you want to call it. Kind of everything after a certain period of time just gets grouped together, even though it's really different. So, this is just a general timeline to kind of show you the order that these go in. And if you look at these dates, you'll actually see that they overlap a little bit. And the reason for that, right, is if you listen to music from each of these periods, sometimes it sounds very distinct. After a certain amount of time, you can listen to a song and you can usually tell approximately when it was written just by listening to it. But with anything, right, it's not they are fixed days. I don't know, 1799 is one period and 1801 is another. It's not really like that, right? Everything is always in transition, if that makes any sense at all. So, and what I mean by that, right, is that a new period of music is kind of the result of a general trend. Because at the time, right, until maybe the early, mid-1900s, what we consider Western classical music was in Europe and in parts of the United States. It was very much what pop music was, right? 1600, 1700, 1800, right? Pop music was what we consider classical music now. And so, right, the same way that from the 60s to the 80s, right, what pop music was changed, right? So first you had, your very classic rock, and then you shifted into your 90s. With each decade, the way music shifts, right? That's kind of what happens here. So for a period of time, right, all of these ideas are popular, and then, a few people start changing it, and then a few people change it even more, and then it changes even more, and then after a certain period of time, right, you have something completely different. And so, my other kind of idea with that is, even though we split music up now into all of these time periods, the way each composer does it, and the way each composer has their style is still unique and still separate, right? So it's not all music from, the 1600s follows the exact same trends or has the exact same kind of logic, right? Every composer has their own personality that comes out in their music, regardless of what's popular. And then other than that is, and this is kind of related to what I was saying earlier, right? All of this terminology of time period, Baroque and classical, Romantic, contemporary, right? All of that really only started being used in the last few decades is when, musical historians started looking back and saying, where did the main ideas or the main values, I guess, of the music that was being played, when did it change and how can we group things based on that? So I think all of that is a little bit confusing or a little bit vague. So instead, I'm going to go through now and break down each of these time periods, what was different about them, and then I'll be playing through some examples. And when I talk about them too, the other thing is that because this was our pop music of the time, like all music, right? Classical music is kind of a reflection of the time period that it was written in. And it was the time period in Europe, really. And what was going on culturally is what is always reflected in the music. So the reason that we have these periods and that we change between these periods is because like socially there was a lot of social change, and then the music changing is just a reflection of that. So I think all of that can be a little bit much or a little bit confusing. So instead, let's start by talking about the Baroque period. So this was from 1600 to 1750, like just about, right? And before this is like the start of what is considered like Western classical music, right? So before that, you had a lot of Renaissance music, which is just like chanting, and then church music, right? But this is like the first time that we had music that was kind of like written in a key, and like the first time that we had a lot of instruments, like the older version of the piano, right, was, sorry, I think there's something in the background, I'm just going to turn it off.
What is it sound?
Yeah, I think so. Yours or Mom's, I'm not sure. Okay, yeah, sorry about that. There was like an alarm going off in the background. But, so as I was saying, right, like before the 1600s, there was like not really that much instrumental music, just because we didn't have instruments. Like they weren't really like invented or hugely popular yet, right? And a lot of music didn't really have like chords or tones. So music was like one line of music, right? So the way a singer sings, right? You could only kind of sing one note at a time. So you couldn't, like if you're singing, right? You couldn't like sing, like that's two notes, right? That are together. And you can't really do that vocally. So this movement, like the Baroque movement, it came out of like Renaissance Florence, where there was a lot of like artists and a lot of musicians, right? And then the main thing that they started exploring is, what if you have multiple lines of like singing at the same time, right? So like if you think about your traditional like choir, right? So you have multiple parts, right? And people are singing different things at the same time. And all of those things are kind of exactly equal, or like at the same level or the same volume, right? So this is like the main idea that they started thinking about. And once you start thinking about multiple lines of music at the same time, right? So say, we're going to talk through this with an example in a minute, right? But, you know, say you have someone singing, right? And then you have someone like singing something else, right? And then those two notes are going to like run into each other, right? So you might have whatever you have, right? Like your notes run into each other. And that's the first time that people started thinking about things like harmony, right? Things like balance, like what sounds good together, right? And what doesn't. For example, right? Those are notes that sound good when you play them together, right? But if you play something like this, right, it doesn't really sound that pretty when you put it together. So this is kind of what people started thinking about, right? And the other thing that really happened during this time is the like European court system that is like very famous, right? Where there's like royalty or some sort of like monarchy, and then you have all of like their courtiers, and you have all of like their, you know, like nobles, like all of those people in like a court together, right? Like living in the same area. That was a system that only really started in like the early to mid 1600s, right? So that, and then there were also people like parsonage, like living at the church, also became more common during this time. And what all of those things did is, when all of these people were together, is they wanted entertainment, right? So this was the first time outside of like necessarily the church that there was a big need for like public music performance. So that was kind of the other driving force behind Baroque period music, right? And the other thing that came up during this time that I'm not going to talk about a lot is like chamber music. So chamber music is when you have like a few instruments, right? And then like 3 or 4 or 5, and then they're all like playing together. So it's all like just it's not solo performance, but it's not a whole orchestra. It's just like a small group of people performing together. And because new instruments were being invented, chamber music was also something that became popular during this time. And so like, the key ideas here, right, is that a lot of social change made people start thinking about like what do we do for fun, and then they started playing a lot of music like in public for fun, right? And this music originally was all based on like the vocal choir, like the church choir, right, where you have like different parts, right? Like you have your sopranos, your altos, your tenors, your basses, right? So based on how high you sing, like what pitch you are as a singer, and all of those people would sing different things in tandem, right? And that's how you would end up with songs. And they said, what if we translate that all to like one instrument? So the key characteristics then of Baroque period music are like this polyphonic texture. So what I mean by that, right, is that it's multiple different lines of music, but they're all equal. None is louder, none is more important, right? None is more significant. So instead, they all exist in balance. So it's like if two people were standing next to each other and singing like completely different things, right? Hopefully those things exist in some sort of musical harmony. But it's like if I was standing here singing something at you and someone was standing next to me singing something at you at the exact same time, right? But we're not like thinking about each other at all, right? It's almost like we're two completely separate people. But when we both sing at you together, right, what we're singing sounds like a song, or like it balances each other out, and what we're singing is like in harmony with each other, but we don't have any like relationship to each other. So that's kind of like what we mean by polyphonic texture, right? And that's what the idea of counterpoint is. So I'm going to demonstrate that with an example now. So one of the most famous composers, right, from the late Baroque is Bach. And so what Bach was really, really famous for is writing like prelude and fugue. So like Bach prelude and fugue is the foundation of a lot of classical music. Like this wasn't necessarily music that was always written for performance, right? But this is more music for like exercise, especially like these days, right? Like you don't really perform Bach prelude and fugue. You just like you learn it because it teaches you important things. So, this is what I mean, right, by polyphonic texture and multiple voices. So, this is Bach's fugue number 2, right? So, this is the main melody, right, of the piece. Oh, 1 second. So, that's my main melody, right? So first, that's my like alto voice that's playing that melody, right? So first we have that, and then after that, your hand is gonna play. That sounds very pretty, right? But what happened to our melody? Well, our melody, which is this, just to remind you. So now our melody is going to move. So now this part, right, this hand, right, this like alto line is singing something else. It's singing this now. And in the meantime, the melody shifted up. So this is now our soprano voice, our highest voice. And you can think of these as like separate musical lines, right? So right? So then after that, right, our melody shifts down. And during that time, our right hand is going. Right? So before, it keeps getting more and more complex, right? First, we had just our melody and nothing else. Then we had our melody up here, right? And there's one line going with our melody, right? And then after a while, our melody will come down here, right? Yeah. So you have our melody again, right? But now our melody has this, right? Our accompaniment has become more complex, but what you have to realize is even there, right? This isn't separate. That's two different lines. That's right? If we were a choir, our highest voices would be singing that part, and our the next group of people, a different group of people, would be singing. Right? So, what I mean by that is, if that makes any sense, is that those are all of our different people singing different things at the same time, and that's the idea of counterpoint, right? None of these people are more important. Just because this is the melody, right, doesn't mean it gets to be any louder, doesn't mean it gets to be any more important. Our melody and all of our other lines all coexist, right? They're exactly equal. And when you think about our melody, right, it's not that simple. It's not what we would call a simple tune, right? When you're singing something, right, that's probably not the first kind of tune that would come to your mind. So some other characteristics, right, of music in this time are that these melodies aren't necessarily simple, and they're not designed to be simple. There's kind of an idea that your melody should be a little bit complex or a little bit, deep. And when we look at this, right, that also makes us, you can see what I was talking about earlier with harmony as well, right? Because if you look at these lines, and if you look at this, but if you play them together, we have, right? So that's where the idea of harmony came from, that we were talking about earlier, and that's kind of what started pieces like this from coming up. That's what kind of pushed music in a new direction in the first place. But some other characteristics, right, beyond that is that Baroque music has a single mood, right? So my piece isn't gonna start out sad and then become happy at the end, or my piece isn't gonna be half angry, half mourning, right? You're not gonna end with something. You're not your mood isn't really gonna change throughout the piece. If you're sad at the beginning, you'll be sad at the end, and you'll be sad throughout, right? And if you're happy, the same idea applies. And then and the next thing is that the melody repeats a lot, which you can kind of see with that fugue. And then the other thing is that if we have changes in volume, right, dynamic changes, right, those will happen very suddenly. It's not we'll start soft and our music will start growing. You're not going to have what's a good example? Right, I'll think of one in a bit, but the point is your music isn't going to start soft and become louder over a period of time. If it changes, it's going to change suddenly. And it's going to change back suddenly. So, those are just some of the many traits of Baroque period music. Of course, sometimes you'll have exceptions. Sometimes you'll have, composers who do things slightly differently. But those are some of the general trends and why they are that way. So, now I'll play the whole, first couple of lines of the fugue so you can hopefully see what I mean. And then after that, if you have any questions about this too, feel free to ask. So this is the first couple of lines of Bach's 6-second fugue. a little bit of that last line there. But those are the first couple of lines. So all of those, hopefully you could follow the melody as I played my way through. Other than that though, so does anyone, sorry, I know that was a lot at the same time as well. So does anyone have any like questions about that, about Baroque music, about any of the things that I was talking about?
That was amazing. I think I've listened to Baroque music before, but never really appreciated the specifics that you explained in the session today. And to hear it kind of being peeled apart, right, like an onion, and seeing the various layers helped appreciate it even more when you put it all back together. So thank you. That was really helpful.
Yeah, that was fantastic. I have a question.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a very fundamental question. You'll probably laugh at me. You see, for a person like me, the fact that your two hands are playing two different tunes is very, very difficult to understand. I mean, very, very, very difficult to comprehend how you could do that. I can't do it.
Yeah, no, I think, and it's not something that, like, it's really just a pianist specific thing, because if you play a different instrument, right, say you play, like, the Western flute, right, or, you know, like any brass instrument, the trumpets, like the clarinet, or even if you played, you know, something like the violin, right, it's not really possible to play, like, multiple lines. Like, I think the flute is a great example, right? You don't really get to do separate things. So it's not necessarily even, that's where like some of the piano background comes in as well, right? So the reason for that is, like, usually if you wanted to do something like that, you would have like multiple instruments, right? Like you would have a small group of people all playing different things at the same time to kind of mimic the idea of a choir. So like the way that your hand plays multiple lines at the same time is, or the reason, right, is that the piano is the only instrument that can do that. And the way you do it is just by, this sounds bad, but just like practicing a lot. That's why like so many pianists, like that's why they make you play prelude and fugue, right? Because ideally as a pianist, your goal would be like, you want like 10 fingers that are like 10 separate brains that can do whatever you tell them to, right? Regardless of whatever the rest of your fingers are doing. And of course, it doesn't always work that way, right? Like that's where like practice and like training comes in. But you're right, it is really, really hard to think about them as separate things, right? Like sometimes when you're thinking about it, you think of them as together because that makes it easier to play, right? Like, so when I play this, like, right? I'm not thinking about it as two separate lines. When I play it in terms of volume, when I balance it with my left hand, right? When I do all of those things, like, then I'm thinking of how to make them all equal, right? That's what I think in my brain. But the important thing is if you deconstruct it, it is two separate lines. So you can't play something like this. Right? Where your like top voice is a lot louder, right? In compared to if you have where you like really emphasize one and not the other. Like that's the kind of thing that you can't do. So when we say separate, right, sometimes we mean kind of separate in theory or separate in deconstruction. That when we play it, like I'm not really thinking of that as two separate things, if that makes any sense. But yeah, that's also why Bach Prelude and Fugue is like, fugue specifically is such great training. Okay, and then, sorry, just gonna take a sip of water. I have not talked this long in a while. Yeah, but that is kind of the quintessential Baroque music. So, moving on, right? As we transition out of the Baroque, oh, sorry, before I do, then, and just some of the many, many, many Baroque composers, right, that you might know are Bach, Vivaldi, Teleman, Scarlatti, Pachelbel, like the Pachelbel canon, and then Handel. So, those are just, maybe you'll recognize some of those names or give them a listen later on too.